I never imagined that the most devastating blow of my life would come not from illness or loss, but from the lips of my own daughter. I sat alone in the back corner of that opulent ballroom, surrounded by shimmering gold balloons and cheerful melodies, watching her ascend the stage. She looked radiant in her deep sapphire gown, ready to deliver her thank you speech. It was her 35th birthday celebration, and I, foolish as I was, had allowed myself to hope for at least one word of acknowledgement. Just one. Instead, what escaped her mouth was a blade that pierced straight through me without warning. She embraced her mother-in-law, Mrs. Charlotte Sterling, pulling her up from her seat with theatrical affection. With the microphone clutched firmly in her hand, my daughter's voice rang out across the hall. "This is the only mother who truly matters to me." The room erupted in thunderous applause. I watched the smiles bloom on faces, camera flashes exploding like fireworks, eyes sparkling with approval. Then, as though that proclamation weren't enough, she turned her gaze directly toward me. In that firm, controlled voice she had so often used to berate me behind closed doors, she added, "You may leave now." The air rushed from my lungs. My hands trembled against my purse as I fought desperately to cling to whatever shred of dignity remained. No one looked my way. No one rose to defend me. It was as though I had been suddenly erased from existence itself. I stood slowly, my knees buckling under an invisible weight, while my daughter, Naomi Du Bois, watched me with that peculiar mixture of contempt and triumph I had seen flickering in her eyes countless times before. But just as I took my first faltering step toward the exit, someone else stood up. My daughter-in-law, Lena Hayes. Lena strode purposefully toward the stage, removed the microphone from Naomi's startled hands, and spoke with a voice that trembled yet remained resolute, words that sent ice through the veins of everyone present. "I cannot remain silent," she began. "Today is your birthday, and yes, you deserve celebration. But you also deserve to hear the truth." The silence that descended was so profound that even the background music seemed afraid to continue. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, marked by that particular unease that surfaces when something sacred is about to shatter. Naomi, bewildered, reached for the microphone, but Lena gripped it with both hands as though her very life depended on it. "You have always looked down on me," Lena continued, her words gaining strength. "You've made me feel inferior. You've treated me as though I weren't worthy to stand beside you. But do you know what? The real mother in this room isn't the one who applauds your vanity or smiles for the cameras. The real mother is the one who has been with you since birth. The one who cared for you, who sacrificed her entire life for you. And that woman is standing right there while you cast her out of your celebration as though she were nothing more than garbage." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. Paralyzed, I could scarcely believe what I was hearing. My daughter-in-law, whom I had always perceived as distant, as someone removed from my struggles, was the only person brave enough to speak aloud what no one else would acknowledge. Naomi went pale. She attempted to laugh it off, to dismiss this as some misunderstanding. "What are you even saying? Don't create drama at my party." But the damage was irreversible. The spotlight had shifted. It was no longer on her. It was on me. For the first time in years, people looked directly at me, as though suddenly remembering I existed, that I was more than merely a shadow in my daughter's carefully curated life. I don't know how long that silence lasted. For me, it stretched into eternity. I heard only my own heart pounding violently, desperately, hammering against my temples. And then I understood. The public humiliation I had believed would destroy me was actually the beginning of something else entirely. I left that ballroom with my head held high and my eyes dry. There were no tears capable of washing away such a wound, but there was something else forming within me, a resolution, fierce and unyielding. Something had ignited deep in my core. I could no longer permit my daughter, the child for whom I had sacrificed everything, to destroy me repeatedly without consequence. The cold night air struck my face as I crossed the threshold. I wrapped my arms around myself and remembered every sacrifice, the sleepless nights tending to her when she was ill, the countless times I abandoned my own dreams to support hers, the years of silence endured to avoid embarrassing her in front of others. All of it had been reduced to a single gesture, to words of contempt spoken into a microphone. As I walked home through empty streets, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. My daughter had sealed our fate with those words. But my daughter-in-law, with her unexpected confession, had opened a crack in that family's flawless facade, a crack I intended to widen until everything collapsed. Because if she possessed the courage to speak, then I would find the courage to act. That night, standing alone before my mirror, I repeated the words I hadn't dared to say in the ballroom. I am not disappearing. I am not surrendering. And that is how it all began. People often believe that the bond between mother and daughter is indestructible, a connection that neither time nor circumstance can sever. I believed it too. Perhaps that's why the pain I feel now is so unbearable, because I gave my entire self to a lie that slowly crumbled into dust. When I recall my daughter's early years, memory tints everything with tenderness. I remember her as a newborn, those enormous dark eyes gazing up at me as though I were her entire universe. I spent hours cradling her in my arms, singing improvised lullabies while exhaustion burned through my spine. I didn't care. In every smile, in every first babble, I found reason enough to keep breathing. I hadn't experienced a happy childhood myself. I grew up in a house where the absence of love was our daily bread. My chronically ill mother could barely manage to care for me, and my father, with his violent temper, took out his frustrations on both of us. I made a vow: it would be different with my daughter. I swore I would give her everything I never had, a safe home, warm embraces, a refuge where she could grow without fear. At first, I succeeded. But over time, the roots of that promise began to crack. Her father, my husband, Marcus, was never an easy man. He was hard-working, certainly, but also proud and emotionally distant. He paid almost no attention to the everyday details I valued so deeply. For him, raising a daughter was a secondary task, a duty that fell entirely to me. He became both judge and executioner of my efforts. If she cried, it was my fault. If she fell ill, I hadn't taken proper care. If she misbehaved, it was because I had been too lenient. And my little girl absorbed every word. She grew up hearing from her father that I wasn't enough, that I lacked character, that I didn't measure up to his standards. Initially, she defended me. But as years passed, she stopped. It became easier to join him than to remain on my side. I remember one afternoon when she was barely 12 years old. I had prepared her favorite meal to lift her spirits after a difficult exam at school. When I served her plate, she looked at me with disdain and said, "Dad says you're a terrible cook." I froze, knife still in hand. I asked if she agreed, and her response was a casual shrug, as if my effort meant absolutely nothing. That day, I understood. The poison of contempt had already taken root in her heart. The teenage years proved even crueler. Every argument became an echo chamber of phrases that weren't truly hers, echoes of her father, and later, of her husband's family. "You're outdated. You're in the way. You never gave me what I needed." And I, instead of confronting her, remained silent. I was terrified of losing her. I believed that if I endured long enough, if I held on tightly enough, someday she would understand everything I had done for her. But that day never arrived. The entrance of her mother-in-law, Charlotte Sterling, completed the sealing of my fate in Naomi's life. That woman, sharp-tongued and gifted with the ability to charm anyone, won my daughter over with attention and flattery I had never learned to deliver so ostentatiously. Charlotte possessed money, social connections, and honeyed words that sounded like music to ears starved for validation. Naomi began comparing me to her, finding in that woman everything she believed I couldn't provide. Each comparison pushed me further into the margins, smaller, more invisible. Gradually, I noticed family invitations dwindling. The photographs she shared on social media never included me. In conversations, I became merely a footnote, an uncomfortable memory she preferred to hide. When did I lose my daughter? That question haunts me through sleepless nights. Perhaps it was the day I accepted silence instead of demanding respect. Perhaps it was when I chose quietude over confronting her father. Or maybe it happened even earlier, when the pain of my own childhood prevented me from teaching her how to truly love me. The truth is that while she grew, I faded. By the time I wanted to react, it was too late. She had already replaced me. She had discovered in another woman the maternal figure I had always dreamed of being for her. And yet, here I am. Despite everything, despite her public denunciation, despite being thrown out of her celebration, despite being told to leave, I am still her mother. And a mother's heart doesn't obey logic. It obeys an instinct that condemns her to love even those who wound her most deeply. That is both my greatest weakness and my greatest strength. Because that love doesn't mean resignation. On the contrary, it means I will not surrender. Even if my daughter denies me, I have a right to the truth. And if she has chosen to forget it, I will ensure she remembers, even if it causes her pain. What happened at her birthday celebration wasn't accidental. It was the harvest of years of silence and contempt. But it was also the beginning of something new. Because now I know, I am no longer willing to continue living in shadows. If my daughter wants to bury me alive, she will have to watch me rise from that grave and return every word, every gesture, every fragment of disrespect. And I won't do it with screaming or violence. I will do it with truth. That truth they fear. That truth no one expects. And that will be my greatest revenge. If I had to describe my life in a single word, that word would be silence. Because what destroyed my relationship with my daughter wasn't only the shouting, the arguments, or the contempt. It was the prolonged silences, laden with invisible poison that accumulated day after day until it suffocated me. At home, my husband Marcus owned every conversation. I learned too quickly that contradicting him was futile. He imposed his version of reality, and both my daughter and I were expected to accept it without question. The terrible truth is that over the years, Naomi didn't merely accept it, she admired it. He became her model of authority, her point of reference. I, meanwhile, was relegated to the role of supporting character, a muted backdrop. I remember one particular dinner. Naomi must have been 16. The three of us sat at the table, and she mentioned excitedly that she wanted to study music. She possessed genuine talent. From childhood, she had demonstrated a beautiful voice and an exceptional ear. I encouraged her. I told her to follow her dreams. But her father laughed scornfully. "Music," he said in that voice that chilled the air. "Music doesn't put food on the table. That's for mediocrities. You'll study law, like your cousin." I attempted to intervene. "Let her choose. Don't force her." He fixed his gaze on me, and before I could say anything further, my daughter interrupted. "Dad's right. You don't understand." Silence fell upon me like a brick wall. That was merely one example among countless others. Every time I tried offering support, my voice was buried beneath the echo of his. She grew up convinced that my words held no value, that her father possessed absolute truth, while I was merely background murmuring that could safely be ignored. But eventually, that role was assumed by someone else, her mother-in-law. When Naomi met the man who would become her husband, Elias Sterling, I thought perhaps life might take a new direction. An opportunity, maybe, to discover a love that would soften her. Instead, what she found was another long shadow that displaced me even further. Elias's mother, Charlotte, presented herself as a confident, elegant, magnetic woman. From the very first moment, my daughter was captivated. I remember Charlotte's initial visit to our home. She arrived bearing a bouquet of imported flowers and sweet words that rang false to me from the start. Nevertheless, Naomi embraced her enthusiastically. As soon as Charlotte departed, my daughter commented, "Did you see how incredible she is? She understands me like no one else." I smiled, though something inside me was tearing apart. That phrase, "like no one else," was a cruel reminder that I had never managed to occupy the place she needed. The silences grew more painful. After that day, Naomi began spending more time with her mother-in-law than with me. She consulted Charlotte first about any important decision. When problems arose, she ran to seek her counsel. I remained on the sidelines, waiting in vain for her to include me, to allow me to be part of things. But all I received were cold silences, glances that passed straight through me, and brief phrases that shut down conversation. The humiliations arrived later, almost without my noticing. Comments delivered loudly in front of others. My mother-in-law always has the right words. You wouldn't understand, Mom. She knows how to plan a proper party. Not like you. I feel more like her daughter than yours. Each phrase was a knife, and I swallowed it in silence. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't want to push her further away. I believed that if I endured, if I stayed close, someday her eyes would open. But time proved me wrong. Silence became habit. I would visit, and she barely spoke to me. I accompanied her to events, and she relegated me to corners. In family photographs, I was the figure cropped at the edges. I didn't even realize she was gradually erasing me until it became obvious I had become a stranger in my own life. The worst part was that I began believing her. There came a point when I myself thought I didn't deserve to be there, that perhaps it was true I hadn't been enough, that my mistakes had outweighed my successes. I sank into quiet sadness, into bitter acceptance that my place had been taken and that no one, not even my daughter, would fight to return it to me. But what happened at her birthday celebration changed something within me. When she told me in front of everyone that I could leave, the silence finally shattered. It was as though all the evidence of what I had tolerated for years struck me head-on. And then my daughter-in-law Lena appeared, unexpected, with a voice that defied that custom of silence. She spoke when I had forgotten how to. In that instant, I understood something crucial. My silences had been my prison. I had locked myself within them, believing that remaining quiet was the way to keep my daughter close. But staying quiet had only stripped me of dignity. Now I knew, if I wanted to recover what remained of myself, I had to speak, even if no one wanted to listen, even if it caused pain. The weight of silence had crushed me for decades. But now, finally, I was ready to break it. And I would do so with truth, even if that truth set fire to everything my daughter had constructed. I will never forget the expression on Naomi's face when my daughter-in-law seized that microphone. She, accustomed to being the center of everything, to never being contradicted, froze completely. For one fleeting second, I thought Lena might limit herself to some trivial comment, perhaps a forced compliment. Instead, what poured from her mouth was a torrent of truths no one had anticipated. And every word was a lash that echoed against the ballroom walls. "Today is your birthday," Lena said, voice trembling yet firm. "And it's fair that you receive affection. But it's also fair that you face what you've tried to hide for so long." The murmuring among guests ceased abruptly. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Laughter died in throats. I felt my heart accelerate as though attempting to escape my chest. Something monumental was about to happen. And for the first time, I wasn't the target of humiliation. I was a witness to truth dragging me from shadow into light. Naomi approached Lena with a strained smile. "What are you saying? Don't create drama at my party." But Lena didn't stop. I watched her grip the microphone with both hands like a weapon. "Your mother gave you everything she had," she continued. "And you, instead of thanking her, made her the target of your contempt. You've allowed others to humiliate her. You joined in the mockery as though it were sport. Do you know what it's like to watch a mother leave your house in tears because you treated her like a stranger?" "I do, because I've witnessed it." A murmur of surprise swept through the room. My throat constricted. I could barely breathe. I hadn't expected such a defense. I had never imagined anyone, especially my daughter-in-law, would possess courage enough to expose before everyone what I had suffered in silence. Naomi grew nervous, glancing at the guests. "Don't listen to her," she said with forced laughter. "She always exaggerates." But Lena stepped forward, lowering her voice as though speaking directly to her alone. "It's not exaggeration. It's the truth you've hidden beneath your parties and applause." The tension became unbearable. I could see Naomi's mother-in-law, Charlotte, rigid in her seat, lips pressed tight, gaze furious. She couldn't bear having her kingdom of perfection shaken. And Naomi, finding herself exposed, began losing control. "Shut up," she screamed at Lena. This isn't your moment. Lena regarded her calmly, and it was that very calmness that made Naomi tremble even more. No, she replied quietly. This isn't my moment. It's your mother's, the one you stole years ago. The words hung in the air like a verdict. I felt my legs tremble, not from weakness, but from a strength I hadn't remembered feeling in so long. It was as though Lena's voice had restored the dignity I myself had buried. The guests didn't know where to look. Some watched me with pity, others with embarrassment, still others with a mixture of surprise and respect. No one dared applaud this time. It was too real, too raw. Naomi, by contrast, was falling apart. I watched her face shift from rage to humiliation, from arrogance to desperation. She wasn't prepared for confrontation, especially not in front of everyone. She had always lived believing she could manage appearances, that with a false smile she could conceal the rot she carried within. But that night, the masks shattered. I wanted to speak. I wanted to seize that moment to say what I had bottled up for years. But I held back. It wasn't my turn yet. Sometimes the greatest act of power is silence well used. Lena had lit the fuse. I had to wait for precisely the right moment for the explosion to become my weapon. Naomi attempted to recompose herself. In a desperate move, she embraced her mother-in-law before everyone. She is the mother I always wanted, she said, nearly shouting. I don't need anything else. But the phrase sounded hollow, empty. No one believed it, because after what Lena had revealed, everyone knew it was nothing more than childish defense, a final desperate thrashing before sinking. I watched her in silence, with a mixture of pain and compassion. On one hand, she was still my daughter, the child I once carried and soothed through feverish nights. But on the other, I no longer recognized her. She had become a woman consumed by her own pride, unable to see beyond her ego. That night, I understood. The war between us had ceased being invisible. Now it was public. And in a public war, the victor isn't the one who screams loudest, but the one who knows how to wait and strike at precisely the right moment. Lena looked at me from the stage. In her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before: complicity. It was as though she were telling me without words that I wasn't alone, that someone was willing to testify to what I had endured. And then I understood. This birthday celebration, which had begun as my condemnation, had transformed into my opportunity. Because Lena's words weren't the end of humiliation. They were the beginning of my retribution. That night after the birthday celebration, I returned home with an exhausted body and wounded heart, but also with a mind ablaze. Lena's words had opened a crack in the facade Naomi had constructed over years. As I removed my dress and let down my hair before the mirror, memories began falling over me like stones, scenes from a past whose wounds had never closed, episodes that had scarred me invisibly. I closed my eyes and saw her as a little girl, barely 5 years old, running toward me with a handful of wildflowers she'd picked in the yard. "You're the best mommy in the world," she told me then, with a smile that illuminated my soul. That memory haunts me because it proves there was a time when I meant everything to her. And it pains me to ask, when did I stop being that? As years passed, those sweet gestures faded. I remember her adolescence as an especially cruel phase. There were days she came home from school, tossed her backpack on the couch, and walked right past me without greeting, without looking. I tried reaching out, asking how her day had been, if she needed anything. She answered in monosyllables or with that silence which hurt more than any insult. One day when she was 15, we argued because she'd arrived home late. I was worried. I had waited up for her with dinner still warm. When she walked in, I asked her to explain where she'd been. She looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and contempt and said, "You are nobody to question me." That sentence split me in two. It wasn't merely adolescent rebellion. It was conscious rejection, a direct assault on my role as her mother. That night, I cried in silence, the table still set, food growing cold on plates. Another episode burned itself into my skin like a brand. It was at her high school graduation. I had worked so hard preparing everything: her dress, the dinner, the details I thought would make her happy. At the end of the ceremony, When organizers asked students to come on stage with their parents, she sought out her father first. I went up too. But when I tried taking her hand, she discreetly pulled it away. No one noticed except me. And that tiny gesture broke my heart. It was as though she wanted to erase me, even from photographs that would immortalize that important moment. The following years became a collection of small and large wounds. I remember visiting her house after she'd already moved in with Elias. I brought a dessert I'd prepared with love, thinking it would please her. As soon as she opened the door, she looked me up and down and said, "Oh, Mom, don't you ever get tired of trying to play the martyr? Nobody here needs your stuff." She snatched the platter from my hands without meeting my eyes. I stood in the hallway with a frozen smile while I heard her tell Charlotte in the kitchen, "Look how she insists on trying to be relevant." I remember that phrase as though it were yesterday. Each wound constructed a wall between us. I tried tearing it down with patience, with love, with resigned silences. But my daughter raised new stones with every slight. It reached a point where I understood she didn't want reconciliation. Her choice was clear. She had decided to give another woman the place that belonged to me. And the worst part was that she did it with cruelty that seemed designed to secure my total surrender. During those lonely nights, I wondered if I had failed as a mother, if perhaps I hadn't given her enough, or if I had been overly protective. Guilt devoured me. I thought my own past, my broken childhood, had shaped the way I raised her. Maybe without realizing it, I had suffocated her with my fears, and she found in Charlotte the free, confident figure I could never be. But then I recalled everything I sacrificed, the years of working multiple jobs, the sleepless nights, the dreams I shelved so she could pursue hers. And I understood. No, it hadn't been lack of love or dedication. The problem was that in her ambition for recognition, she chose to deny her roots. I was the inconvenient part of her story, the one she preferred hiding to shine before others. Those open wounds never closed. And at her birthday celebration, they all bled simultaneously. When she told me in front of everyone that I could leave, it wasn't merely humiliation. It was the cruel summary of years of accumulated contempt. But the difference now was that I would no longer remain silent. Because those wounds, though they hurt, had also forged me strong. Every hidden tear, every swallowed insult, every avoided glance had tempered me like iron in flame. And if my daughter thought she could still break me, she was mistaken. Now I was the one willing to break the silence, to raise my voice, to wield truth as a weapon. That night, I made myself a promise. There would be no more tears shed in vain. The wounds would remain, yes, but they wouldn't be signs of defeat. They would be my battle scars. And with them, I would march toward the battlefield awaiting me. The battle for truth that had yet to be revealed. Pain teaches, but humiliation sharpens. After that celebration, when I heard my daughter publicly tell me to leave, I understood the time had come to transform my scars into weapons. I could no longer expect gratitude where only contempt existed. I had remained silent too long, endured slights that branded me like hot iron. But that night, with Lena's words echoing in my mind, I decided I would no longer be a victim. A plan began germinating in silence. It wasn't the first time I'd considered defending myself, but I had always lacked courage. This time, however, anger was my engine. I was no longer seeking reconciliation or tenderness. I was seeking justice. The first thing I did was open the drawers of memory, the ones I'd kept closed from fear of what I might discover. I remembered that my husband Marcus, before his death, had left a trail of economic secrets, dubious investments, documents he always concealed with suspicious vigilance. For years, I preferred not to look, not to ask, telling myself it was men's business. But now I understood. Within those papers could lie my most powerful weapon. I began visiting the home office that had been abandoned. The smell of dust and aging paper accompanied me as I sifted through yellowed folders, sealed envelopes, contracts I had never dared read. At first, I felt lost, like an intruder in my own home. But patiently, I deciphered every line, every number, every signature. I discovered that my husband had conducted deals with my daughter's in-laws, financial favors that entangled our destinies more than I ever would have wanted. And there was the irony. The mother-in-law my daughter now venerated actually owed me more than she would ever admit. This was dynamite. And I knew it the instant I read it. I didn't want to rush. I sought help discreetly. I contacted a trusted old friend, Mr. Arthur Bell, a retired attorney who had always respected me. I brought him the documents and asked him to explain what they truly meant. I remember him looking at me with widened eyes. "Do you have any idea what you're holding?" he asked. "With this, you could sink your daughter, her husband, even the entire in-laws family." A shiver ran down my spine, not from fear, but because for the first time, I understood I held power in my hands. I began formulating my strategy. I made copies of everything, securing them in different locations. I even gave a sealed envelope to my lawyer with clear instructions should anything happen to me. It wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. I knew Naomi's arrogance and Charlotte's cunning too well. If they discovered what I knew, they wouldn't hesitate attacking me with everything they had. In public, meanwhile, I continued playing the role of the frail, nearly invisible mother. I attended family gatherings. I smiled when necessary. I lowered my head to avoid raising suspicion. No one imagined that behind that facade, every gesture, every word, every glance was being calculated. The key to everything was patience. I knew Naomi would make mistakes. Her arrogance made her careless. Her need to prove she didn't need me would lead her onto dangerous ground. I simply had to wait for the right moment to reveal what I held. At night, as I reviewed my plan repeatedly, I found myself thinking about the past. How had we arrived here? How had the little girl who hugged me to sleep transformed into a woman capable of casting me from her life as though I were a nuisance? Sometimes the pain nearly made me falter. But then I remembered every slight, every look of superiority, and my resolve turned to steel. I also thought extensively about Lena. Her bravery at the birthday celebration had been the spark igniting the fuse of my plan. I wondered what motivated her to speak, if she did it for me, or because she too had suffered at my daughter's hands. I didn't know. But I was certain of one thing: that woman, who initially seemed a stranger, could prove an unexpected ally. The plan wasn't merely about exposing the economic and social truth of my daughter and her mother-in-law. It was bigger than that. I wanted to dismantle the facade of perfection they had constructed at the cost of my humiliation. I wanted everyone, absolutely everyone, to see what was hiding behind those applauses, those false smiles, those empty speeches. Once, standing before my mirror, I dared speak aloud as though rehearsing the day of revelation. "I don't want your affection," I said, imagining Naomi before me. "I don't need your applause. All I demand is respect. And if you don't know how to give it willingly, I will take it from you with truth." That mirror became my accomplice for weeks. I practiced words, gestures, even silences. I would not improvise. When the moment arrived, every phrase had to be precise. Every pause had to sink her deeper into her own lie. And while everything simmered in darkness, I smiled in public, accepted slights, pretended not to hear mockery. Inside, however, I repeated over and over, "Wait, Isabel. Wait. Your moment will come." That moment was closer than anyone could imagine.